It was a little past midnight, the house shrouded in silence, when my phone buzzed unexpectedly on the nightstand. Half asleep, I grabbed it and answered, and my girlfriend's voice came through in a broken, desperate whisper. "Can you come over? Please." "Something happened," she said, the words spilling out in a voice so frightened that it made my blood run cold. She didn't offer any details, only that something was terribly wrong and that she needed me there. I hurried to explain to my parents as I slipped on my shoes, their sleepy, confused faces barely registering in the haze of worry fogging my mind. I got into my car and sped off, my thoughts racing just as fast. What could have happened? Was she hurt? My mind cycled through possibilities, each one worse than the last, but nothing could have prepared me for what I would find. As I neared her neighborhood, the first signs of trouble were already evident. A patrol car blocked the entrance to her subdivision, its lights casting eerie red and blue flashes against the surrounding trees. I rolled down my window, explaining to the officer that my girlfriend had called me, sounding terrified. He seemed to hesitate, his eyes studying my face before he finally nodded and waved me through. As I drove deeper into the cul-de-sac, the scene that unfolded was like something out of a nightmare. Multiple police cars were parked haphazardly around her street, their lights casting ghostly shadows over the quiet suburban homes. An uneasy silence hung in the air, as if the whole neighborhood were holding its breath, watching and waiting. I parked a few houses down, feeling the stares of officers as I stepped out of the car. Just as I was about to knock on her front door, my girlfriend appeared, sprinting out of the house toward me, her face pale and tear-streaked. She threw herself into my arms, shaking uncontrollably, and began telling me what had happened. Her voice was trembling, her words almost incoherent as she struggled to explain. Apparently, it had all begun just after midnight. Her next-door neighbor, a middle-aged woman who lived alone, had been asleep in her bed when a noise startled her awake. Before she could even sit up, a shadow loomed over her, and she felt the sickening impact of something heavy striking her skull. Pain exploded in her head as the blows continued, each one landing with brutal force. Through sheer adrenaline and desperation, the woman somehow managed to push past her attacker, stumbling out of her house and across her lawn, blood streaming from her head. In a daze, she made her way to my girlfriend's house and began pounding on the door, her fists slamming against the wood with all the strength she could muster. Inside, my girlfriend's mother had already been on edge. Her husband was out of town, and she had been a little uneasy about being alone with her daughter. When she heard the pounding at the door, she rushed to answer, only to be met by the sight of her neighbor, drenched in blood and barely able to stand. Without hesitation, she pulled the woman inside, closing the door behind her as she tried to process the horror of what was unfolding. But just as she managed to lock the door, she glanced up through the small window at the top and froze. Outside, on the other side of the glass, was the attacker. He was standing there, staring in with cold, empty eyes, his face shadowed under the dim glow of the porch light. In his hand, he held the heavy, blood-splattered object he had used to bludgeon the woman. My girlfriend's mother acted on pure instinct, quickly pulling her neighbor further into the house and attempting to close the door. But the man suddenly lunged forward, ramming the weapon into the door, cracking the glass in a violent explosion of noise. The small window shattered, glass shards raining down, and my girlfriend's mom let out a scream. The attacker paused, staring at her through the jagged opening, a small, almost mocking smile spreading across his blood-splattered face. Then, without a word, he turned and walked off into the night, his figure vanishing down the street, swallowed by the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. The police were called immediately, arriving within minutes. They questioned my girlfriend's mom and the injured neighbor, scouring the area for any trace of the man. But he was gone, slipping away into the darkness without leaving so much as a footprint. 4 hours, the neighborhood was in lockdown, every house bathed in the cold glow of flashing lights as officers combed through backyards, alleyways, and nearby streets, hoping to find some sign of the attacker. But there was nothing. No clues, no witnesses, just the eerie, suffocating silence that seemed to settle over everything as the night wore on. The police insisted on keeping watch over my girlfriend's house for the rest of the night, patrol cars stationed outside to ensure the attacker didn't return. I stayed with her on the living room couch, both of us too shaken to even consider sleep. She kept her head on my shoulder, trembling as I held her close, my own eyes darting to every shadow, every slight sound. Each creak of the house seemed magnified, every whisper of the wind a reminder that someone had been here, lurking right outside. As dawn broke, the once familiar house felt like an alien place. My girlfriend's mom walked us over to the foyer, where dark stains still marked the floorboards where her neighbor had collapsed. Blood had splattered above the doorframe, painting the wall in dark streaks, a visceral reminder of the violence that had taken place mere hours ago. We stood in silence, the weight of what had happened settling over us like a heavy shroud. Over the next few days, life in the neighborhood seemed to change overnight. People locked their doors, kept their lights on, and whispered about the man who had appeared without warning, slipping away like a shadow. The neighbor, traumatized and scarred, decided to move shortly after the incident. She didn't speak about that night, and neither did we. It felt almost like a shared, silent pact. Acknowledging it somehow made it feel too real, too close. But even as the days turned to weeks, the memory of that night lingered. I would lie awake at night, replaying the scene in my head, the broken glass, the blood, the way he had simply vanished. And sometimes, just on the edge of sleep, I could almost imagine him out there, lurking in the shadows beyond my window, watching and waiting. 4 years afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every knock on the door, every stranger passing by the house sent a chill down my spine. There were times I would wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I'd heard something, a soft thud outside my window, the faint crunch of footsteps in the gravel outside. I'd lay there in the darkness, heart pounding, straining my ears for any sign of movement. And even now, sometimes late at night, I still wonder, where did he go? What drove him to such mindless violence? Was it truly random, or had he come to our neighborhood that night with a purpose? And more chillingly, did he ever leave?